great pleasure to chair the next talk by Kevin Zollman. He already gave a talk. I think it was the first installation of this workshop series, a very interesting talk. And I'm looking forward to this one too.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers and the other speakers. I'm delighted to be back and giving another talk and to have heard the great talks already. This one will be both similar and different in some respects. So I'm excited to hear your feedback. Like the one from the previous conference, this is actually a different chapter of the book that I'm writing now. So I'm very eager for any feedback that you have. As you know, it's still in draft form and everything like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between two topics which have already come up a little bit, especially in Alessandro's talk, homophily and polarization, but looking at it from a kind of mathematical modeling perspective, trying to think about how we might model in the simplest way possible these two different phenomena that are somewhat interrelated and to understand their interrelationships. I'm going to go through some models, mostly somewhat quickly because of the time constraints. If you have any clarificatory questions or anything like that, feel free to put them in the chat. I have that open and I'll try and, as I see them, answer them right away because I'd rather take a second to make sure that we're all on the same page. The basic questions that I'm interested in here are the relationship between three concepts, which I think will be somewhat familiar to social epistemologists. The first is homophily. Alessandro mentioned this already, but let me just offer a quick definition. The idea here is that like people tend to interact with one another. So that is, I tend to find myself interacting with other people that are similar to me according to a variety of dimensions. In particular, I'm going to be interested in epistemic homophily, which I'm going to say is the propensity of people to interact with others who have similar beliefs. So maybe epistemic's the wrong word, maybe something like belief homophily, but something in this neighborhood. The second is polarization. Polarization is a tricky word because it gets used in a couple of different ways. I'm going to be interested in sociological polarization. So that is the thinking of polarization as a feature of a group as opposed to the feature of an individual. So that is, a group is polarized if people tend to be further apart in terms of their belief. If they tend to cluster, that is, if beliefs tend to also correlate with something like who people interact with and this sort of thing. So that's the idea that I'm interested in. And then I'm interested in the relationship between both of these and the epistemic performance of the group. That is, are groups that are homophilous or polarized worse epistemically than groups which are not homophilous or polarized. And I'm going to work on two kind of conjectures. These conjectures, I don't want anybody to take this super seriously as interpretation of either Sunstein or a general belief in social psychology. I just feel like these things are sort of running throughout the works of Sunstein and social psychologists, and so I'm kind of pinning it on them. My apologies if this is a false interpretation, but I think it's okay. So Sunstein, in a lot of his recent work, especially #Republic and that, seems to be pointing to this idea that homophily, really by itself, making groups more homophilous or making it easier for groups to be more homophilous, leads to increased polarization, which in turn harms the epistemic performance of the group. Okay, so this is a kind of causal claim because it's a claim about the relationship between this one variable, homophily, and polarization, and then in further down the chain, epistemic performance. There's a similar kind of conjecture, which it's hard to find somebody that says this outright, but it sure seems like a lot of people think it, which is, I'm calling the social psychology conjecture, which is that polarization, and perhaps homophily as well, is the result of something like individual bias or irrationality. That is, that their sort of correct epistemic performance would not lead to polarization and would not result in homophily. And so we can explain or reduce the sociological phenomena of polarization to individual level bias or irrationality. I don't, since I'm not so up to date on epistemic vice literature, I'll leave it to you to tell me whether this also might be true about if we replace the words bias and irrationality with epistemic vice. But that might be a similar conjecture. I don't know if anybody makes that conjecture in that literature, so I didn't want to say that somebody was saying that, but you can see the flavor here. The kind of philosophical positions that might come out of these two conjectures are about the relationship between individual irrationality and what we might think of as collective pathologies. So individual irrationality leads to polarization, which then harms the epistemic performance of the group. And then the other way, in order to reduce polarization, we need to improve epistemic performance. We need to do that by fixing people. That's the way to solve this, is by getting them to be less irrational. It's not that that's a necessity claim, but that's maybe a kind of claim of like, this is the best way or the most likely way, or potentially a necessary way. I'm going to challenge these two philosophical conjectures, and I'm going to do so by introducing a model which I think shows how something which might be regarded as defensible epistemic performance can lead both to polarization and homophily, and how and indeed harm epistemic performance. And so to argue at least a little bit that polarization and homophily are, while in reality may be caused by all sorts of biases and vices and things like that, need not be. So I'm not going to make a strong claim like everyone is rational. That's definitely not what I think, but rather that we shouldn't think of there being this very tight connection between the group pathology and individual irrationality. And I'm going to do that by three very closely related computer simulation and mathematical models of behavior, which I think illustrate this disconnect. The first one is going to be broadly a kind of what you might think of as a wisdom of the crowds kinds of models. The idea here is that we're going to start out with a group of people that have a guess at something. It could be anything, right? You could imagine this is a guess at the weight of an ox. That's the classic wisdom of the crowds example. It could be the correct amount of taxation. It could be whether or not Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the previous presidential election in the United States, or whether vaccines are safe, or whatever you like. But it's something which we're going to represent as on a continuum. So it can be a probability, or it can be a judgment of rate or amount or something like that. But it's something which we can represent as a continuous quantity, and that people's beliefs are represented as that continuous quantity. Right, so that their beliefs can change continuously over time. So I can think 0.7 today, and I can think 0.6 tomorrow, and 0.5 the day after, something like that. We're going to assume that each person on average is correct. So individuals are unbiased in the statistical sense of that word. That I could be very, very wrong. I could be far away from the truth. But if you think about on average, the community is correct. So that's the wisdom of the crowds part of this. And of course, this isn't the way that humans are with respect to all problems, but it is the way that humans are with respect to some problems. And then we're going to model them as interacting socially. And the first thing we're going to do is model their interaction socially using a very common now and very simple model called a pooling model. So the idea here is that each individual is going to have a conjecture, that's their belief at a given time, and they're going to average their conjecture with their friends. And that's going to be their new conjecture. So if my belief is 0.5, Mihaela's belief is 0.6, and Alessandra's belief is 0.7, then what I will do is I will average the three of us, and my new belief will be some weighted average of that. The weighting is I might give more weight to myself or less weight to myself. That's what the term alpha is in this equation. But otherwise, that's all this equation says. So if you don't want to read equations, no problem. I just told you exactly what it says. I adopt weight, and then I do that process again and again and again and again. This can be a normative process of belief change. It can also be just a simple psychological description of the way that we're influenced by one another. I'm going to be somewhat uncommitted about whether we interpret this normatively at the moment. It turns out that actually there's a lot known about these processes. If the network is weakly connected, that is basically there's a path from everyone to everyone. Eventually, the network will converge to a single consensus. Everyone will have the same belief. And if the network is regular, that means everybody has the same number of friends, that consensus will be the mean. So you'll have a wise crowd if the network is regular. If the network is irregular, then you will be unwise to varying degrees. And we can even quantitatively compare the degree of irregularity of the network to the badness of the social beliefs. So there's actually this really nice mathematical result. But that's assuming that we have a kind of fixed social network that people live in, and they're changing their belief without changing their friends. That's not how reality works. We change our friends too. And so that's going to be what I introduce. I'm going to introduce homophily to this model. And the way I'm going to introduce homophily is via a very simple process. So people are going to live in an initial social network. And then with some frequency, a parameter that we can play with, two new people will be introduced to one another. And if they're introduced to one another, they'll compare beliefs. If the new person's belief is closer than one of their current friends, they abandon their friend who's furthest away from them and add this person as a new friend. So they say, I'm going to get rid of my two Republican friend and add you because you're more Democratic than my previous friend. That is, if I am a Democrat. And then the other person will do the same. So you can imagine we've been introduced to the party, or I see your tweet online, or we have an interaction or whatever, and we decide whether to add each other as a friend. If we're closer, we add each other as a friend and drop someone who's further away. If we're not closer, we never again, we may meet again, I suppose, by a random chance, but that's it. So that's the homophilous process. And we can ask, okay, so in this very simple model, what does adding homophily do? And it does exactly what you think it should do. So this is a series of 4 examples going from left to right, where we increase the rate of introductions. So we increase, in a certain sense, the opportunity for homophily. On the far left, there are no opportunities for homophily, and you see the group very, very quickly converges on a consensus. So that was the mathematical result that I described earlier. As we move across the screen, they meet new friends with faster and faster rates. And so as a result, you see that they no longer converge to consensus. And in fact, the distribution of beliefs across the group becomes wider. So on the very far right side, you see the community has broken up into a bunch of subcommunities that all have very similar beliefs. And in fact, we can represent that with a social network. That's the picture on the right. I'm sorry about the contrast, because they're so tightly clustered. It's a little hard to see it, but there are social network connections within each of those little tiny groups, but there are none in between them. So the group is broken up into many, many, many different groups, and the color in that picture on the right represents the beliefs of individuals. Okay, so this is, I just gave you 4 examples, but we can do a more systematic search, and I'm happy to show you a slide with graphs if you're interested, that shows that this basic conclusion is true. That is that increasing the rate of introduction, that is increasing homophily, leads to more fracturing of the community, leads to more divergent beliefs, and also harms epistemic performance, because it means that people are on average further away from the truth than they would be otherwise. So this model provides, I think, an initial support for Sunstein's conjecture. Right? So this is an example where increasing homophily increases polarization and harms epistemic performance. So right away, we have an initial confirmation. But now I'd like to move on to a second model. So in this model, all the information that there is to have is information from the beliefs that people initially begin with. This is kind of the classic wisdom of the crowds model. The idea is that, I have an initial conjecture. That initial conjecture was formed by looking at the ox or the jar with jelly beans in it or whatever. And there's no learning process going on. I'm not getting new information. So now I'd like to add in learning, and I'm going to do this by stealing an idea from another person who's worked in these kind of pooling models, Zollman and Krauss, who thought of learning as by adding a kind of pull towards the truth. So now the idea is that, on each round, remember, what people were doing is they were averaging their beliefs with their neighbors. They were sort of computing a new average by a new belief by being pulled in the direction of their neighbors. we're going to add in an additional term, which is a term where I'm getting pulled also toward the truth just a little bit. Okay, so you can think of that as a little bit of new information arrives. I'm performing an experiment. I'm trying something out. I'm reading an outside source like a newspaper or listening to the BBC or who knows what, but something along those lines that is pulling me towards the truth just a little bit. But we're going to assume that two things. That first, everyone is still averaging with their neighbors, so they're still affected by social learning or social interaction, but not everyone is pulled towards the truth. So there's some fraction of the community that is being pulled towards the truth, but not everyone in the community is being pulled towards the truth. If we again imagine that we have a community where there's no homophily, so that is where everyone is, on a social network that never changes, you can actually show that this community will eventually converge towards the truth, whatever the truth is. In this case, on all my graphs, I'm going to make the truth 0. That is, Donald Trump did not win the election or something like that, but it could be any number. It doesn't matter. So this is really nice, right? This is a non-homophilous group will converge towards the truth, assuming that this model correctly describes their process of social learning. And then we can ask, what happens if we add homophily? And again, we kind of get the results that you would expect. The problem of the presence of homophily is that it causes people to start ignoring those who are pulled by the truth. Okay, so in this graph, we have two types of people, the blue people and the red people. My apologies if you're somebody who can't see those colors. I've not figured out a way to make this graph visible in any way to those who can't see the difference between blue and red, but I'll just try and describe it in a way that's helpful. On the left-hand side, you see that the group is sort of being pulled towards the truth, which is in this case 0, and there's a sort of vanguard of the individuals who are being pulled towards the truth that are sort of pulling the rest of the group. Those are the blue people, the people who don't have any access to the truth. As we introduce homophily, so that as we move across the graphs from left to right, we see that the red people, those that are pulled by the truth, break away. So they keep heading towards the truth because they're getting information that leads them towards the truth, but they're not influencing anyone. They're being abandoned because those people are like, oh, those people are too different from me. Their attitudes are too strange. I'll hang out with this other person who's more like me. And it turns out that that other person who's more like me is somebody who isn't pulled by the truth. And so those people are getting left behind. Right. So they're getting left behind as homophily increases. So we can now ask, okay, so the first question was, does homophily lead to polarization? The answer in the second model is yes. But we can ask, is it good epistemically? And actually now it's tricky. The answer becomes a little complicated because for the case of the people who are pulled by the truth, they're glad for homophily because they quickly learn to stop interacting with those people who don't read the New York Times or listen to the BBC or whatever it is. They interact only with other people that are also pulled by the truth. And so they can share information. They can be pulled even more rapidly towards the truth. So if I'm a truth seeker person, I am glad for homophily because I get to shed the dead weight of those people who aren't learning about the truth. On the other hand, if I'm a non-truth seeking person, I don't want to be in a homophilous society because then I'm going to get abandoned and likewise abandon those people who are pulled by the truth and end up stuck with a belief that's probably wrong. Okay, so already we see that the degree to which we want to say that homophily harms epistemic performance is actually somewhat complicated. It depends to a certain extent on who we're asking about. But on the whole, in this model, it's bad for the group on average because I've said there are just as a modeler decided that only 10% are pulled by the truth. But of course, I could have chosen different values. So that's my choice rather than a philosophical conclusion. Okay. The last model that I want to investigate is one where we introduce the possibility of misinformation, which is, I think, to connect with a topic which is central to this workshop. So in the previous model, we imagined that there were some people that were pulled by the truth and some people that were not, simply not, right? They just hung around and were influenced by others, but that they didn't learn anything on their own. Now we're going to add in a third type, and that type is pulled by the falsehood. Right. So you could imagine that these are people that are subject to misinformation, or these could be the people perpetuating misinformation, or these could be the people, who have a financial interest or something like that. But whatever it is, their beliefs are going in the opposite direction of the truth. They're just in the same process, sort of slowly being pulled away from it. But that's what's happening. And that could be, could be intentional, like they could be they could be the Russian intelligence agency intentionally slowly moving in that direction in an attempt to mislead the public. Or it could be that they just happen to have epistemic standards that mean that they tend to trust their friend who's a conspiracy theorist and don't trust their friend who's not. So they're just being fed the wrong kinds of information, even though they may be epistemically reasonable themselves. So again, we're going to now have three types. Type 1 is just ordinary agents who are not influenced in one way or the other. Type 2 are agents who are pulled by the truth, and type 3 are agents who are pulled by the falsehood. We can ask, again, in a world with no homophily, how is this community going to do? And now the answer is, it depends. It depends on all sorts of details. It depends on the relative size and social connections of type 2 and type 3. That is, the types that are pulled by the truth and the types that are not pulled by the truth. If there are too many misinformation people, or are they too influential in our social network, then the entire group could end up believing the falsehood. Or alternatively, if the truth people are more influential, or there are more of them, then the entire group could end up believing the truth. Or if you're right on that knife edge, you could end up with a group that just sticks right in the middle and nothing ever happens. And that's kind of what I've pictured here. So here on the far left-hand side of the screen is a picture of what the group looks like if you have both the truth and falsehood people. So keeping with the previous one, the reds can be the truth people, the greens can be the falsehood people, and the blues are the people who don't do anything. So somehow I think these graphs are really pretty, but they also illustrate something somewhat relevant, which is, you see, as we add homophily, that is, as we move across the screen from left to right, the groups break apart. So, take a look at the far right-hand side graph. All the people that are pulled by the truth are pulled over to the truth. All the people that are pulled by misinformation end up at misinformation. And then you have a bunch of people sort of stuck in the middle. These are people who are neither pulled by the truth and neither pulled by the falsehood. And so they just abandon both types and just stick more or less around where they initially started. So that's what's going on here. So what can we learn from all of this? Well, so again, we have our third example of the same phenomena, which is in all three models. We've seen that increasing homophily, or increasing the opportunity for homophily, leads to an increase in polarization. That is, you get groups that isolate themselves more, you get groups that are more spread out in terms of belief. And so in that part of Sunstein's conjecture is true. Now, what about epistemic performance in the context of this third model? Well, again, we have that same somewhat complicated issue here, which is that, again, it's not clear what we want to say about whether the group is epistemically better off, because it depends on who you are. If you're pulled by misinformation, you would rather be in a group without homophily, quite clearly. Right? If you're not pulled by any information, now it's a little complicated, because some of the people who are pulled by no information do better without homophily. Some do better with homophily, and it's hard to know ahead of time which person you're going to be. So probably you're better off without homophily, but it's sort of barely better off, is what we would want to say. And then if you're pulled by the truth, like in the previous model, you're better off with homophily. So you would prefer homophily. Okay, so there is, already we see a somewhat complicated relationship here. so there's already this complex issue. And then there's one last complexity that I want to talk about just a little bit, which is that I want to ask just about, suppose that I know that I'm the kind of person that's neither influenced by the truth nor influenced by the falsehood. So I'm one of those blue people, those people who just listens to what other people has to say, changes my mind on that basis, but doesn't do any research, good or bad research, on my own. What would I like? What community would I like to be a part of? Well, if I could be part of a completely non-homophilous community, where there were more people that were pulled by the truth than not, that's what I would like. But suppose that I was part of a homophilous community. So I know this is in reality, we live in a group where people interact with others who are like them. Suppose that that's fixed now. So we can't reduce homophily, but I can do other things. Would I like to be in a community with more truth seekers or fewer truth seekers? And would I like those people who are subjected to the truth to sort of have access to more information? That is, they're sort of pulled by the truth to a greater degree, or they're pulled by the truth to a lesser degree? And the answer to that question is that it's somewhat complicated. So I don't want to walk you through some of the details of these graphs. So let me just give you the conclusions, and then in the question period, if people are interested, I can give you some of the more details. If I'm one of these people who isn't influenced by the truth or not, but I want there to be more truth seekers than misinformation seekers, that's for sure. But there is a kind of maximum number that I would like. So, I wouldn't take these numbers that seriously, but what I would like actually is there to be about 60% people that are influenced by the truth. In this case, we're holding fixed that 10% are subjected to misinformation, but I don't want there to be 70%. And the reason for this is that if there are too many truth seekers, they break away too fast and they don't influence me as much as I would like. And so there's a kind of balance here between two different social processes. One is, of course, the faster that they're influenced by the truth, the better that is from a certain perspective, because that means that I can also get indirect access to their information by listening to what they have to say. But if they move too fast, they will seem too strange to me too quickly, and I'll abandon them, and I'll become disconnected from them. And so the degree to which it's good to have people in your community that look for the truth, and the degree to which it's good that they have access to lots of information, is actually somewhat modulated here. Yeah, you do want there to be a lot, but not everyone, right? Not all, or almost everyone. And you do want them to be to be pulled in the direction of the truth, but you actually don't want them to be pulled too quickly. You don't want them to have access to too much information. And so I think that this is maybe the surprising or interesting conclusion. That is that in our society, we do actually want to be careful that we don't make people too epistemically good if we're only making a few people epistemically better, as opposed to making everyone epistemically better. It's a kind of, I don't know, almost democratic ideal. We don't want there to be a smart elite, but rather we would rather sort of raise everyone rather than improving the elite. Okay, so I've been a terrible scholar because I've just told you about my model and not told you about a bunch of other models that none of which are the same, but are similar in a couple of different respects. Because of the short time period, I'm not going to detail the similarities and differences between my models and others, but there are a bunch of other models. Of important note is Kaylin O'Connor, who's giving the next talk. She and Jim Weatherall have a paper on scientific polarization, uses a somewhat different model. But I think that all of these different models, even though they make different assumptions and work in different ways, they don't necessarily come to the same conclusions, but they don't come to any contradictory conclusions. So I think that this is a nice example of a situation where there are a bunch of different models that all show the same thing, which gives us some hope that maybe we're learning something true about the world. Okay, so just to come back to the conjectures that I started with. So let's start with, how does Sunstein's conjecture turn out? Well, the first point is that Sunstein's conjecture, the first part seems to be correct. Homophily leads to belief polarization. Yes, I think that we've shown that in a world with nothing but homophily in a certain sense, the groups will polarize. To what extent this is good or bad for epistemic performance is somewhat complicated. It depends on who you care about. It depends on who you're interested in improving their epistemic performance. And it depends on the balance between the number of people who are pulled by the truth and the number of people who are subject to misinformation, and the degree to which they're pulled by the truth and the degree to which they're subject to misinformation. So Sunstein's conjecture, sort of half of it wins, another half of it turns out to be true in some cases, but not in others. What about the social psychologist conjecture? Well, this becomes a little bit more complicated because built into this model is this process of iterated averaging with one's neighbors. And the degree to which we want to call that as rational is a big debate. And I don't want to veer off course and take us down that road, but there are some people who think it's rational fully. There are some people who think it's boundedly rational. It's pretty good given our constraints. And there are some people who don't like it at all. So the degree to which my agents are rational will be sort of connected to or subject to another debate, which I think is a little outside of our purview for the day. The second question is whether or not homophily is rational. And here I think that the issue is somewhat complicated. Eric Olson in his model has a discussion of this, as do a few other Bayesian philosophers, epistemologists, philosophers of science, who think about these sorts of issues, which is, look, if I think that I'm pulled by the truth, which most people do, if I think I'm pulled by the truth, then homophily is good, is rational for me. I should disconnect from other people who have very different beliefs from me and connect to other people who have similar beliefs, because the chances are, if I'm pulled by the truth, they are too. And so if people who are subject to misinformation think that they are subject to true information, which is what we observe, then it's not clear that they're engaging in something that is irrational, given the beliefs that they have. And so it may be that I think it's actually homophily is something which can be regarded as rational or appropriate, even though it leads to these bad consequences. That is, from a subjective standpoint, it's hard to tell somebody that they shouldn't engage in homophily because they're connecting to other people who they think are more reliable and disconnecting from people who they think are not. Okay, so just to wrap up, sorry, I'm just a couple of minutes over time. I think that these philosophical positions that we started with is don't hold up to scrutiny. So that is, individual irrationality does not necessarily cause polarization. It can be the result of broadly rational behavior. And polarization does not always harm the epistemic performance of the group. There is at least some senses in which it's good. And if we wanted to reduce polarization and improve epistemic performance, it's not necessarily about fixing people. They may be engaging in a fully rational or fully reasonable behavior on their own. And so as a result, if we want to stop polarization, we may have to ask people to do things that from their individual perspective, they might perceive as fundamentally irrational, at least from the individual selfish perspective. So that's broadly what I think we can conclude from these models. The models I mean to be kind of how, idealized proof of concept things. So I don't mean these to be models that are like, this is the real world. But I think that by isolating these phenomena, it allows us to isolate these philosophical conclusions and to illustrate ways in which they might be false. And then the next question is, what about real societies? Do those real societies, are these claims true or false about real societies, recognizing that they're not necessarily true or false universally? And so that's where I hope I've left us. And thanks very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk. And the floor is open for discussion, and just write question or Q into the chat, and then I can call you. Yeah, first question by Tatjana Scheffler.
Yeah, thank you. While others are thinking of their questions, I have maybe I don't know. Maybe it's a technical question, or you tell me whether you want to answer it. But when you were introducing your model of homophily, I thought it was kind of well, on the one hand, is simplified, obviously, but also quite radical, right? I give up on my previous connection completely, and now I replace them, and obviously thinking about real life cases of polarization. You have some connections, like your brother-in-law or something. So even though they go down the rabbit hole, you might not give up on them, right? And yeah, and there may be things in between. And so my question is really, how much do your results depend on exactly how this is modeled, right? So if you were to change it a little bit, would everything come out completely differently, or what do you think?
Yeah, good. I think this is a very good question. You're absolutely right. There is a sense in which it's once I'm introduced to a new person, I have this very radical reaction to them. I might not ever meet them, so it's not as though I sort of globally find the person who's most similar to me. But if it turns out that I happen to meet somebody that's similar, I might abandon them. And you're absolutely right. There are certain kinds of connections that we have which we don't abandon, or at least it takes a lot to get us to abandon them. Family members, people we work with, that sort of thing. A couple of thoughts about that. I do think that while it's true that we don't abandon those people, we do abandon them maybe for the purpose of the model. That is, it is the case that while I do interact with my mother-in-law and father-in-law, who I view as epistemically quite disastrous, we never talk about politics. And so for the purpose of the model, we're disconnected. From a sociological purpose, we are still connected, but their political beliefs have no influence on me, and my political beliefs have no influence on them, because we simply do not exchange political beliefs. They don't, other than being quite different from one another. I actually don't know whether they think Donald Trump legitimately won the last election or not. And I have a guess, and I would rather not know, but I don't. And so in that respect, I think that the model it seems radical because the connection in the model is representing only the exchange of a particular idea, whatever the topic that we're modeling it is, when in reality, of course, we maintain connection. But even then, I think your point is a good one, which is even then there are some connections that we just don't abandon. We get in our arguments at holidays with our, brother or whatever about politics, but we never disconnect from them. The results, I think, so long as those represent a relatively small share of our total network connections, it would influence the results in like the infinite long term, but in reasonable amounts of time, it would not have an influence. So all of those mathematical results that I stated, those will actually hold. So there will, in the infinite long run, we will converge to consensus under certain types of conditions. But it might take arbitrarily long, depending on how often those are. So I don't, so long as we regard those as rare, I think that it's no problem. But if we thought that a huge amount of our social connections were not subject to homophily in this way, then yes, indeed, I think it would be a problem. So yes, it might be a problem. I tend to think not a significant one, but I don't have evidence for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So next question is by Mike.
Hello, a very interesting talk. So I thought about the first model with pure homophily, that this might be a kind of argument for a lotto system or a choice polling for decisions which I have in America with the jury duty system, which we had in Athenian democracy with the selection of representatives. And just recently, it's about a year or so ago, I lost the sense of time with this pandemic, that the German newspaper asked readers to identify for themselves certain positions, and then they brought together people to discuss a certain position. So this is a kind of way of shaking up this phenomenon that you showed. And I just wanted to know, what you think about that. The second point, I would like to mention this effect of too much truth seekers around you having this potentially bad effect. This reminded me of a play that I think the German speakers in the audience will know, Nathan the Wise Man, by Lessing, 1780 or so, where there is a crucial scene. So the scene is like that. So it's about the three religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and it is sort of not clear who has the truth. And there is this scene where a person asks God, "Don't give me the truth. Give me the way to truth." And this sort of reminded me very strongly about your finding here. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So with respect to your first question, I agree definitely. So, there's this kind of democratic ideal, and there's this movement called deliberative democracy, which aims to do exactly what you're describing, sort of Habermasian ideal of discourse, where if we just bring people together and allow them to talk with one another, that will improve the epistemic situation. In the context of this model, that would definitely be good, because that would sort of counteract homophily. That is, it would be the equivalent of constantly adding in new random connections that were not correlated with belief, that would help to break the degree to which people are isolated from one another. I don't think the model is unique in terms of its underwriting of that ideal, but I think that the model would say that in this context, such an ideal would be productive. In the context of at least the first two models. In the context of the third model with the misinformation, now it becomes a little trickier, because if too many people are subject to misinformation, then actually bringing the group together to discuss will increase the influence of those people, will prevent them from sort of breaking away and forming their own crazy group, and so would be harmful. So I think that broadly, that seems like a good idea, but it's not universally so. It would need to be the case that we were confident that people were not systematically, the group as a whole wasn't dominated by people who are subject to misinformation. On the second hand, this question of should I know the truth or should I get my way to the truth? I actually really like that quote, because I think that's very consistent with those last results, which is, in a certain sense, it would be bad for me to jump immediately to the truth in a homophilous society, because in doing so, everyone would say, oh, well, look at crazy Kevin is out there with his extreme belief. Nobody is going to agree to that actually I would have more influence, and it would be better for the community if I sort of moved there somewhat more slowly, so I could bring people along with me. And I think that this is an illustration of that phenomena, where, and I think this is also a common historical phenomenon. The very early anti-slavery advocates in the United States were regarded as so radical as to not even be worth talking about. Whereas, of course, today, right, to be an anti-slavery advocate, I mean, that's no surprise, and no one thinks that you're a radical.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is by Kylie O'Connor.
Hi, Kevin. So I wanted to ask about the assumption that you have these kind of groups of people who are the ones pulled by misinformation, the ones pulled by good information. And I have to apologize because it's morning here. I missed the very beginning of the talk, so maybe you did a lot of work already to justify this. But I just wanted to ask you to sort of how realistic you think this is, like what sorts of situations you think it best applies to. I guess I tend to think about when I'm thinking about real homophilous groups where people hold similar beliefs, they tend to kind of trust the things shared in that group or by confederates, whether or not they're pulling in the right direction or not. The sort of truth sensitivity isn't the only thing that matters to whether they follow information. So yeah, I just invite you to comment on that.
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, because there is a sense in which, the complaint that one might raise about this model is, that the process of gathering truth or misinformation in this sense is sort of just like heavy-handedly imposed by the modeler. I just describe it as a thing that people are pulled toward, or a thing that people are pushed away from, or something. So what is that meant to model? Well, that's meant to model, and I think you already sort of touched on it. You already have in mind what I was going to say, which is just that they might have a certain set of epistemic standards that makes them trust a certain type of information that is arriving over time. So the idea is something like, you might get, if I follow Newsmax here in the United States, which is a kind of far right conspiratorial type of news organization, news in quotation marks, they give me, they don't give me all the information all at once. They sort of, oh, today we're doing a story about this right-wing thing, and then tomorrow they're doing a story about this other right-wing thing, and then this, and so they're giving it to you bit by bit. And so then you could imagine somebody who watches Newsmax as somebody who's subject to those things. Now, the last part of your question, which is I think the really deep issue, which I don't deal with very well, is I'm assuming in the model that those epistemic standards are sort of fixed over time. I'm either a truth seeker, misinformation, subject to misinformation, or subject to neither. And the point that you bring up, which I think is right, is that those epistemic standards are those same things that might be shared. So somebody might, I might initially not know about Newsmax, and then a friend of mine who shares similar beliefs or might say, hey, you should check out Newsmax. And so now I shift from being somebody who's subject to misinformation to somebody, or shift from being somebody who wasn't subject to misinformation to somebody who was. And so my epistemic standards might shift with my social location or something like that. And that's something which gets left out of the model. And I think is something which is a real phenomena, but for simplicity's sake, I think I've just left out. How much of a difference that would make, I honestly don't quite know. I would guess it would just attenuate the phenomena that I'm already observing, if it was that I sort of adopted the epistemic standards of other people around me. But that's a conjecture that would need to be investigated before I feel comfortable. Crap, Gail, and I feel like I'm missing something else that you were asking about. Is there something that I missed?
I mean, I guess I was thinking more of situations where, imagine your group that generally has what we might call poor epistemic standards. So say they're watching a ton of Fox opinion, right?
Yeah.
And that's generally not a great news source, but they trust the news source. And so if the news source is providing good information, which sometimes it does, they are pulled in the right direction, And so I guess I was thinking, like, are there people who they're not even a stopped clock where it's right some of the time, they're just going in the wrong direction all the time. But on the other hand, I know this is the same sort of assumption as in like the Zollman and Krauss model, for example, where like some people get pulled to different places. So it's not like it's a crazy assumption, but yeah, that's just what I was
No, that's absolutely right. And maybe a slightly more interesting and maybe slightly more realistic model would be to have people that are sort of pulled toward a random point that changes over time and has a bias. So you might imagine that it's like, well, look, I read the New York Times. I hope it's the case that the New York Times is more reliable on average than it's not. But the New York Times does sometimes feed me misinformation. I don't think intentionally so, but they sometimes get things wrong. And they do have their own ideological slant, maybe slightly more centrist than I would prefer, something like that. And so as a result, I'm going to be pulled maybe in the direction of the truth, but every once in a while, they'll point me in the wrong direction. So I'd be like a noisy, like a, in that, like a biased random walk toward the truth, as opposed to sort of just straightforwardly marching there. And similarly, yeah, I mean, it's not as though absolutely everything Newsmax says is false. They say a lot of true things too. And so there is a sense in which they get pulled sometimes towards the truth, but on average, they're getting pulled away. My guess is that wouldn't make too much of a difference, except just make the process noisier. But it's something that should be looked at. I mean, the model, as you well know, that these models can do things that you don't expect them to. And so yeah, it's a really good suggestion and one that I hadn't thought of, but it makes sense that I am sort of assuming a uniformity to the source of information, which is maybe a little unreasonable.
Okay, I think you can switch to the next question by Kasim Kassam.
Oh, hi, Kevin. Thanks. That was great, and I think I agreed with most of what you said. I just had a couple of very small questions. So one was just about your terminology, the terminology of being pulled or not being pulled towards the truth. So that seems to me to be ambiguous in the following way. So you could have someone who's influenced by the truth, and so versus someone who isn't, and you can have someone who is a seeker of the truth versus someone who isn't. And you can be a seeker of the truth, and indeed care very deeply about the truth, but not in fact pulled by the truth. And that is, I guess, the position of a lot of conspiracy theorists who certainly think that they are, out for the truth. And so I just wondered, with respect particularly to the issue of rationality versus irrationality, whether that was significant. Because of course the conspiracy theorists will say, well, I hang out with other conspiracy theorists because we're the only people who care about the truth, even though in fact they are not in fact pulled by the truth in the other sense. So that was one question. And my other question was really about the thing you just said about slavery and the view of the anti-slavery campaigners. So as you said, that in a way they might have been more effective at carrying other people with them if they were, as it were, more moderate or more compromising in their opinions. But in fact, as you know, the sort of many of the anti-slavery campaigners actually characterize themselves as fanatics, and as fanatics because they thought there were some issues concerning which you just could not compromise. So saying to them, well, you'd be more effective if you toned it down a bit, and if you. So I'm just wondering, well, what would toning it down a bit really mean in a real case like that, and what would your practical advice be to someone, in that period of American history, who knows the truth, right, that slavery is horrible? So are you saying that they should be compromising on that question, or what?
No, I don't think that. But I think that my motivation to say that is precisely what leads me to think that we're in this is a good example of a situation where there is fundamentally a conflict between what is normative for an individual and what is normative for a group. So that is that I wouldn't want to say to somebody like John Brown, who was a radical anti-slavery movement. I grew up in Kansas. He's a local hero to Kansans. I wouldn't want to say, John Brown, you should tone it down because you're not helping the situation. I think John Brown was right. And I wouldn't want to say to somebody who believed in the truth, stop believing in the truth because it would be better for the group. But it is also the case that it would be better for the group if that person stopped believing the truth. And so I think that my view is that this is really one of those situations where we just have two different things, and it's not quite a paradox because they don't contradict one another, but they're at the edge of a paradox, which is the group would be better if the people in it were more moderate. And in fact, the group would be better if some of the people in it were epistemically worse. And I think that's just what it is. And I have another paper where I sort of argued that this has the same form as like the prisoner's dilemma, which is, the group would be better if everyone cooperated, but it's not the case that it's that it's the right thing to do for people to cooperate. And so I just think that that is the situation of social epistemology. So that's to answer your second question. Let me come back to your first question. You're absolutely right. Pulled by the truth is this very macro description, which can be instantiated by several different micro processes, some of which we might regard as rational but unfortunate. And the conspiracy theory examples, I think, are perfect examples. Like, these people are true, like they care about the truth, and they care about the truth more deeply than a lot of people who don't think about conspiracy theories. Like, I've met a few people that are anti-vaccine here in the United States, well, with COVID vaccine, maybe it's complicated, but I was thinking about anti-vaccine prior to COVID vaccine. The ones that I've met know more about the way that vaccines work than does your average person. They just interpret that in the wrong way, and have kind of the wrong epistemic standards, and so it leads them astray. And so that's I think that broadly supports my point, which is to say that there's a sense in which these people, by being homophilous, think they're doing the right thing. They think that they're connecting to other people who also care about the truth, but it doesn't have to be that way. This model can be other things too. Those people can be epistemically terrible. They can know the truth and be actively trying to move away from it because that's in their financial interests, or because they want to mislead, as in your examples, they want to destabilize or whatever. And so I think the model itself is somewhat undecided about which those are. But the point that I want to make, and which I think you made, which sounds like you agree with me about, is that there is an instantiation of the model where people are being rational. And for my sort of possible, how it is possible, that kind of conclusion, that's all I need. But you're absolutely right. There's more than one way that this can be instantiated.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Christoph Hesse.
Yeah, so I was thinking sort of in the same direction as Kevin, being influenced by people, and shouldn't that change whether you're a truth seeker or a non-truth seeker? But what if it isn't about the other person? What if you just introduce sort of a lenience in the agents in this relation to say, okay, wherever I start out, I'm sort of malleable to change, because I mean, it might be that it just introduces some noise and attenuates the effects, but I found it quite interesting that in the simulation where you didn't have the truth seekers and the non-truth seekers yet, and you had a high homophily, the group size, the friend groups were quite small. So I'm thinking maybe it doesn't just model the picture, maybe it does something very specific to the group size, which could be quite interesting, right?
Good. Yeah, that's interesting, actually. So, let me clarify something about the way the model works. But this, I think, then actually makes your question more of an objection, which I will have to deal with. In the model, it's assumed that everybody has a fixed number of potential friends. And so as a result, what ends up happening in the long term when you have homophily is those groups become almost as small as they can possibly get. That is determined entirely by that parameter of the model. So if I can have 2 friends, the groups end up being 3 people, right? If I can have 3 friends, the groups end up being 4 people, right? It's always one more than the number of friends I can have. But that's weird, right? Because it's not as though in reality I can only have 2 friends. That's sort of an assumption of the model, which is not reasonable. And so you might think that I could change the number of friends that I could have, and that might be influenced, like, well, whether I add in this new friend or add in this new friend and drop an old one might also be determined by their distance, right? So it does seem a little strange that I might say, like, I met somebody who shares my belief infinitesimally more. They're infinitesimally closer to my belief than you, my old friend. But as a result, I'm abandoning you entirely, and I'm adopting this new person. And so you might imagine a model where, say, my probability of dropping you or losing you as a friend depends something like on your distance. And there are a few models that kind of look this way. The Zollman-Krauss model can be thought of as a version of this. And there are a couple of variations on the Zollman-Krauss model that work in that way. And so in that sense, I think, so the thing I would say is I definitely agree with you that there are parts of this model which I think are not necessarily realistic, and some conclusions which I wouldn't want to draw from it. So something about group size, for instance. I think that I can manipulate that by changing parameters of the model, none of which I think are correct. And so I think that something like the groups are very small is not a conclusion that I would want to draw from the model, because I think it does depend on some of these very fine-grained, like, going out to the 18th decimal point comparisons that I don't think real people do. The more general phenomena that people break up into groups, that's going to happen even if we allow for slight variations in that. And so that's part of the reason why I didn't want to emphasize that part. But so I think you're absolutely right that that's a part of the model which is unreasonable. But at least from my perspective, I think it's a part that we can sort of ignore and still use the model in its simplicity to generate conclusions.
I was just thinking in terms of the decision process for choosing friends, right? If you give different agents different leeway and sort of how flexible they are in their opinions. So you have very opinionated agents versus less opinionated agents. Maybe what you would find if you had different friend choosing algorithm would be that you have larger groups that are larger because they allow more heterogeneous ideas in them, and you have more focused groups, which would be not just more realistic, but it would be quite interesting in terms of how the clustering, how the partitioning of this epistemic space actually works.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, and I agree. Like, one thing, there's lots of homogeneity in the model, which is unreasonable, and this is one respect in which you're absolutely right. Everyone is paying attention to this belief. Everyone is adjusting their friendship network using exactly the same algorithm to exactly the same degree, and the friendship introductions are themselves, you know, we just choose two people at random from the whole of the population and introduce them. But you might imagine that that's all of those things could be heterogeneous. Some people care more about their belief, and in particular, and this is where I think it might actually cause problems for the model and would be worth investigating. If that turns out to be correlated with I'm a truth seeker versus I'm not a truth seeker, which it might plausibly, now things are going to get complicated. And there it seems quite reasonable. Like, look, for me, it's very important that people take COVID seriously. And I'm much more like, and I think that because I'm influenced by the truth. And so as a result, I'm much more likely to just not interact with people who aren't taking COVID seriously because I'm influenced by the truth. Whereas they just may not pay attention to that. And so, you know, and so it might be that if the heterogeneity tracks, is correlated with the degree to which you're influenced by the truth, that might influence the model in some significant ways. I'll need to think about that one a little more. I think that's a good point.
Okay, so we have one more question by Alessandra Tenesini, but unfortunately we are already at the end of our time, and maybe you can discuss in the break before the next talk by Kylene O'Connor, and so that you two at least have a chance to discuss about her question, and for all others can take a small bio break and thank the speaker again.
Great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.